Whether or not the Trojan War actually happened is one of the most debated questions in the archaeology of the Bronze Age Aegean and the Near East. And it is closely related to another question. Is the Iliad accurate to any meaningful degree? And further, was the poet Homer actually real? This is what's known in the field of classics as the Homeric question, and this video will briefly explore some of the main arguments brought up in trying to answer that question. The historicity of the poet Homer, essentially, was he a real person, is debated by modern historians of Greece, but it was argued about in antiquity as well. Traditionally, Homer has been seen as a wandering, blind poet who was credited with gathering the various parts of the Iliad and the Odyssey, and compiling them, memorizing them, and then telling the stories of the Trojan War. Ancient writers, historians, and philosophers thought that Homer had come from one of several places. The island of Chios was a favored place for his birth, as was Ios, and most famously, Homer was believed to have been born in the city of Smyrna, and then moved to Chios to ply his trade as a bard. Assuming that Homer was actually real, then when would he have lived? The ancients debated this as well. Herodotus, who lived in the 5th century BC, believed that Homer lived about 400 years before he did, which would place Homer in the 9th century BC. There has been a lot of work done on this particular aspect of the Homeric question, and we know that one of the people who was believed to have been his student, Archaic, is supposed to have been born in 744 BC, if he himself was indeed a real person. If that is correct, and if Homer was real, then he likely would have had to have lived in the 8th century BC. Of course, this is all assuming that Homer was in fact a real individual. There is another group of scholars who don't think that he was real at all, so if that's the case, then how do we explain the Iliad being credited to Homer? The proposed answer is that Homer was a job description, that is to say, it was a profession. One was not Homer, but a Homer, a term which would be understood in this argument to describe a type of wandering bard or maybe a minstrel. If that is the case, then it has also been suggested that maybe the Iliad and the Odyssey were composed by two different Homers. There is a long tradition of this type of argument which goes back to at least the 1700s, and at one point, a line-by-line comparison of the writing style and rhythm was attempted of the Iliad and the Odyssey, but that study was inconclusive, and no real scholarly consensus has ever been reached on that idea. We do know, however, that in southeastern Europe there's a tradition of epic oral poetry which uses rhyming schemes to aid in memorization. So, regardless whether or not Homer himself was real or was multiple people, there is evidence in the broader region that long-form poetry was a form of entertainment. We know that the Greek alphabet began to be used at least around the 8th century BC, although that data was being tweaked, so one of the main arguments, if not the main argument, about the tradition of Homer is that prior to the Iliad and the Odyssey being written down sometime between the 8th and the 6th centuries BC, it was an oral tradition. But we also know from separate studies of oral traditions of epic poetry from the Balkans, which is what gave rise to this idea, that details can differ depending on the poet and the poem in question. So with that in mind, can we date the Iliad to the Bronze Age, or the Iron Age, or perhaps sometime in between? And if it is accurate to one period, does it possibly contain elements of another period as well, which have been mixed in over time? The Bronze Age collapsed in about 1200 BC, and the ensuing Greek Dark Age saw many cities and palaces of Bronze Age Greece abandoned, and many of those same places were not inhabited again during the Iron Age, essentially during the period of classical Greece. Helen, who left Sparta and went to Troy and who was largely the catalyst for the whole Trojan War, is famously known as the face that launched 1,000 ships. Those ships are listed in Book 2 of the Iliad, in a passage known as the Catalogue of Ships, which lists all of them, their captains, and the cities and towns from which they set sail. 1,186 ships are mentioned in all, and the majority of the cities and towns from which the ships departed date to the Bronze Age, but they were abandoned by the time that Homer was supposed to have lived, that is, during the 8th century BC. It's accepted by many scholars that the Catalogue of Ships is an accurate piece of information about Bronze Age Greece, at least to a degree, that was passed down via oral tradition until it was written down during the Iron Age. The major issue, of course, is that there are Iron Age cities in this list, which did not exist during the Bronze Age, so what's happening here is that two different traditions are probably being mixed. Then, of course, there are the weapons used in the Trojan War. The armor in particular appears to date to the Bronze Age. Hector, the Prince of Troy, is described as using a tower shield, as are several Greek heroes. Hector is also described as wearing bronze armor, and the presence of greaves, corselet, sword, shield, helmet, and spears are always mentioned as being donned in that same order, and they are almost always described as bronze. The description is important for two reasons. The first is because the archaeological site of Dendra has turned up a full suit of bronze armor dating to about 1450, which appears to be similar to that which Homer describes. And reason number two is that because Homer would have lived in the Iron Age, and the frequent description of bronze weapons and armor suggests that at the very least something earlier is being described. And, actually, tower shields and the boar tusk helmet that was described by Homer had gone out of use by the end of the Bronze Age, so it's quite possible that something from earlier than that period has slipped into the Iliad's narrative. Other descriptions of the weapons, however, appear to blend aspects of both the Bronze and Iron Ages. The Greeks, as described by Homer, generally carried two spears, and they were usually described as throwing the weapons. The Iliad describes chariots as having 8-spoked wheels and pulled by 4 horses, and which bring warriors to the front lines, all of which are Iron Age fighting techniques, as opposed to the Bronze Age, where a single long spear would have been much more common, the wheels having 4 spokes and the chariots being pulled by 2 horses, and which were employed during the time not as transport to get to the front line, but as mobile fighting platforms from which arrows could be shot. And lastly, there is the description of the shield of Achilles, which famously features the face of a Gorgon, a style of decoration not present during the Bronze Age. So, what are we to make of all this? Well, there are really 3 points of view here. The first is that there is serious doubt that the Iliad is historical at all. It appears to have preserved elements of the Bronze and Iron Ages, but so what? Using it as an historical source, according to this argument, would be like using a piece of fiction to help figure out the 21st century, if very little was known about that period, because we know the 21st century had cars, and the piece of fiction in question featured cars. That doesn't necessarily mean anything. So, there is then doubt that the Trojan War actually happened. If it did, then we should principally be employing other texts, not the Iliad. The second argument is that because of the break in historical memory that occurred due to the Bronze Age collapse and the general loss of writing, elements of the Iliad were not officially, quote-unquote, known prior to the advent of archaeology in the 19th century. So if it is featured in the Iliad, it's very likely that this is in fact a preserved memory, albeit in garbled form, of actual fighting techniques, armor, weapons, and cities from the Bronze Age. So if all of that is real, then what else contained in the Iliad is correct. And lastly is the argument that the Iliad needs to be used with care, because it is accurate as far as late Bronze Age and early Iron Age descriptions of weapons and probably some form of conflict go, but it also contains elements of earlier events, places, and people, like the tower shields and the boar tusk helmets. There is also the account of an early expedition to rescue Helen which does fail, and which then sees Achilles and his band of warriors engaged in military activity to the north of Troy, several months prior to the start of the Trojan War. This particular piece comes from the Kypria, a lost poem of the epic cycle, of which the Iliad is just one part. There is then perhaps a tradition of Greeks sailing across the Aegean and fighting the Trojans well before the actual Trojan War as told in the Iliad happened, so perhaps we should not think of the Trojan War as a single event, but rather as multiple events, of which the Iliad is a record of just one war. So, should the Iliad be considered accurate? To a degree, probably, yes it should. The Trojan War, or wars, probably did not occur because of Helen. It probably was fought due to political and commercial reasons if it did indeed happen. However, the description of fighting and the details about the weapons and armor probably do reflect Bronze Age Greek fighting techniques and equipment as shown by the surviving archaeology from that era. Probably what has happened is that prior to the Iliad being written down, elements from the Iron Age crept into the narrative as aspects were slowly altered to keep it fresh for various audiences. Or they could simply be errors that have built up over time. This leads, however, to another question, and one that will be covered in its own video. There are several different Hittite documents that describe fighting in western Anatolia and the Aegean coast during the Late Bronze Age, but it is over at least 2 centuries, and several of those fights involved Troy. So if the Iliad preserves some sort of memory of a conflict involving the city of Troy, which Trojan War was being described?